So these are notes 2.4 for U.S. history class. They cover Hoover and the Great Depression and what he did before leaving office in 1932. So the reality of the Great Depression was that it affected almost everyone in America. Everyone's lives went from very good to almost unbearable. There wasn't a lot of ways to escape the reality of the Depression. People were homeless, they were hungry, they had no jobs, and they wanted to escape. So the only industries that did well during the time period were the things that helped people escape the reality of the Depression. Those industries included things like movies, radio, and books and photographs. So things where people could look at a different reality, not their reality. For example, some of the movies and entertainers of the time period that maybe you might be familiar with, Gone with the Wind was made in the 1930s. And so for hours, people went to the movies and would watch this and could escape reality. Groucho Marx was also very popular. Comedy, gets your minds off your troubles. Here we have Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. That was a very popular movie in the 30s and trying to get things done in Washington when things weren't happening. And Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, Walt Disney, lots of different short cartoons as well as his feature-length Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs came out in the 30s. So lots of things you're familiar with come from that time period. And again, in radio, some of the shows are shows that you probably have at least heard of. Maybe you've heard of Jack Benny and George Burns, who were comedians who became popular in the 30s. The Green Hornet, that started in the 30s. The Lone Ranger, again, another radio show in the 30s. And for those of you who like soap operas, The Guiding Light actually started in the 1930s as a radio soap opera and then changed over to television later on. Then in art, books, photographs, we have American Gothic, the painting here. I'm sure you've seen those two people with their pitchfork before. Grant Wood is the artist. He's there underneath. You've read probably in English class, you were supposed to read Of Mice and Men with Steinbeck. Steinbeck becomes very popular during this time period. In fact, one of the books that he writes is called Grapes of Wrath. It comes out in 1940, and it's actually about the Great Depression and follows a family and their, I want to say, misadventures during the Great Depression, because it's really pretty depressing. And then here in the top right, you have Dorothea Lange and her most famous photograph, Migrant Mother. Dorothea Lange traveled around and actually took photographs of the people who were impacted by the Great Depression, took photographs of Hoovervilles, and so those became very popular. You have some others that you might know their names, Faulkner, Thomas Wolfe. These are all just famous artists, authors during the time period because people wanted things, like I said, where they could escape their reality because their reality was not entertaining. So reality is not good during this time period, so people have to come up with ways to escape it, and Hoover has to come up with a way to fix the reality that people are trying to escape. So Hoover starts relying on voluntary efforts by industry. He thinks that businesses will do this on their own, and then things will get better. So promises not to close business or lower wages anymore, that will help the people recover. So he figures business can do that. Obviously, as things worsen and businesses can't hold up their end of the bargain, they back out. Hoover did start some of the first public works plans and activities during the time period. So the public works, the government financed building projects, which meant they hired the workers, they paid for it. This is really the first public works projects in the United States. And it does some good, but it's very limited. So it's just not enough, which is why Hoover gets blamed for doing too little too late. So the reality is the only way to actually fix the economic issues in the United States during the time was to actually massively increase government spending and to go into debt. And Hoover was not willing to do this. So you might ask, well, why wouldn't Hoover increase spending? Well, up until this point, we had never been in debt as a country, so that was not something we were used to like we are today. That also means we'd have to raise taxes to pay for the projects, so that would be one possibility. And so now you're going to take money from people who already don't have a lot of money, the consumers, and that's going to hurt businesses even more. The other option is that going into debt. So you keep the taxes low, you run a deficit budget. So you spend more money than you have coming in, which means you have to borrow it. If you're borrowing the money, that means there's less money out there for businesses and consumers, and so you're actually hurting them that way. So Hoover looks at this, he thinks that doing either one of these, raising taxes or running a deficit budget, is actually going to hurt the country more than help. It's going to delay the recovery. So he sees the Great Depression as being just a year or two, no big deal. And so let's keep things going strong so that in the end, we recover quickly. We know in reality that this was not going to be a quick recovery and that he had to do something. But remember, this is looking back on it, not being in it. So we also have the problem of money, which is Hoover believes in trickle-down economics. So the government ensures that banks can loan money to businesses so businesses can expand and hire more workers. He believes that if we make sure the top has the money, it will eventually get down to the workers and consumers. In reality, that's not how it ends up working in the Great Depression, and by having this belief, he's seen as not doing anything to help the American public. So what Hoover sees is he's got 3 steps he has to do. Step 1, we need more money. And so the idea is that he asks the Federal Reserve to actually put more money into circulation. The Federal Reserve refuses to do this. And remember, we said there were some mistakes by the Federal Reserve. Now, the Federal Reserve was concerned that if they put more money into circulation, it would cause inflation, which is prices go up and the value of the dollar goes down. So they were concerned about that. Step 2 in Hoover's plan of trickle-down economics was get banks to help banks. And so in this, he created the National Credit Corporation, or NCC, that would actually lend banks money that they then could lend to corporations, and so the corporations, the businesses would then have money, and this would help. Well, it's a great idea, except there wasn't actually enough money put into the NCC, so they really couldn't help much. The third step was government helping businesses. So by 1932, the government itself was the ones doing the lending, not other banks. Hoover created the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, or RFC, to loan money to businesses to help them succeed. The problem with that was they were actually very cautious about who they lent money to and how much they lent, which meant they didn't put enough out to stimulate the economy. And so that means we still have problems. And the final piece of Hoover's beliefs was to always avoid relief spending. He did not want to give money to the individuals who were impacted as individual citizens. So Congress actually overruled this in 1932. They created the Emergency Relief and Construction Act, and they gave money to help citizens directly, which was not part of Hoover's plan. So even Congress was not supportive of Hoover by the end of his first term, and in 1932 we have FDR run for election against him. So Congress is not happy, and neither are Americans. We have some very angry Americans by 1932. As the Depression continues and it continues to get worse, and people feel like they're not being helped by the government, they become very resentful and very angry with the government and Hoover in particular. By 1931, the year before the 1932 election, open revolt had begun to occur in America. We have hunger marches that are happening. They begin in January in Oklahoma, and they spread all the way up to Washington, D.C. These are actually backed by the Communist Party, which creates some issues with the police, because we don't support communism, remember, where you have the Red Scare and all of that. And they don't result in a whole lot of change because so many Americans, mainstream Americans, don't support the Communist Party. But they are bringing attention to the idea that people are starving and they have no way of even getting food. This is a huge problem. Americans aren't supposed to starve. We also have the farmers' revolt. So we talked about how farm prices were a problem. There was not enough food. And we had the Dust Bowl. Well, in 1931, we actually had farmers who were destroying crops to create more of a shortage to try to raise farm prices. And so that's actually going to increase problems even more between farmers and the rest of America. It does not increase prices, but it does create more food shortages, which cause more hunger in the U.S. And finally, we also have the bonus army that happens in the 1931. So what this is World War I veterans had been promised a $1,000 bonus that would be paid to them in 1945. So all of these people, they're homeless, they're unemployed, they need the money, so they march on Washington to try to get their money early because they need the money. So in 1932, they start in Oregon and they march all the way to D.C., picking up supporters along the way to try to get help. It ends up with over 15,000 men in Washington, D.C., trying to petition the government and petition Hoover to get help. So these men who had been fighting in World War I, so they're veterans, Hoover refused to meet with them and didn't even attempt to talk to them. So they ended up living in Hoovervilles, abandoned buildings, and eventually police actually forced them out. So media coverage shows the government attacking veterans who are asking for their bonus in order to make their lives better. So it really turns public sentiment not just against the police, but also against Hoover and the government and what's happening. So Hoover didn't do a whole lot, and what he did do was relatively ineffective. So he's blamed for the Depression, and then he's blamed for doing too little too late. So this really sets the stage in 1932 when FDR comes up and has this new deal for the American people and this idea that he's going to make change and he's going to actually help the individual Americans. People like that, and they vote for FDR. And so our next set of notes is actually going to talk about Franklin Delano Roosevelt, our next president, and what he promised the American people and what he tried to give them in the 1930s.